I never thought a single envelope could destroy a family. Not because it contained money. Not because it exposed a crime. But because it revealed the truth. The kind of truth people spend decades hiding. My name is Ethan Carter. I'm 34 years old now. I live in Denver, Colorado, and I own a commercial construction company. 5 years ago, I sat in a lawyer's office while my stepmother smiled across the table and watched my grandfather's final wishes get rewritten in front of me. Or at least that's what I thought. At the time, I believed I'd lost everything. What I didn't know was that Grandpa had spent years preparing for exactly what happened. And 5 years later, when my stepmother finally opened the letter he left behind, her entire world collapsed. To understand how we got there, I need to go back to when I was a kid. I was 10 years old when my mother died. Cancer, 8 months from diagnosis to funeral. One day she was helping me with math homework. The next, she was too weak to get out of bed. My father, Richard Carter, changed after she died. For a while, I thought grief had broken him. Then he met Vanessa, and I realized grief wasn't the problem. Vanessa was. She came into our lives less than a year after Mom passed away. She was charming when other people were watching, cold when they weren't. The first thing she ever said to me when Dad left the room was, "Your father deserves a fresh start. Don't make things harder for him." I was 11. I didn't even know what I'd done wrong. 3 months later, they got married. 6 months after that, she moved her son, Tyler, into our house. Tyler was my age. From that moment on, there were two sets of rules. One for him, one for me. If Tyler forgot his homework, the teacher was unfair. If I forgot mine, I was irresponsible. If Tyler broke something, it was an accident. If I broke something, I got grounded. If Tyler got a B, everyone celebrated. If I got an A-. Dad asked what happened. It sounds small when I say it now, but when you're a kid, those little things become your entire reality. You start believing you're the problem. You start wondering why you're never enough. The only person who saw what was happening was my grandfather, George Carter, Dad's father. Grandpa wasn't wealthy back then. At least not compared to what he became later. He owned a small commercial roofing company. But he was the kind of man everyone respected, the kind who remembered birthdays, the kind who showed up. Every Saturday, he'd take me fishing, not because I liked fishing. Honestly, I hated it. But those mornings were the only time I felt seen. One afternoon when I was 15, he looked at me and asked, "How bad is it at home?" I remember staring at the water, trying not to cry. Then everything came out. The favoritism, the insults, the constant criticism. All of it. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he put his hand on my shoulder and said something I'll never forget. "Ethan, some people need a scapegoat because they can't face themselves. Don't become who they say you are." At the time, I didn't fully understand. Years later, I would. Things got worse after that. Tyler became the golden child. I became the inconvenience. By 16, Vanessa was openly telling relatives I was difficult. By 17, Dad barely spoke to me unless he was criticizing something. By 18, I couldn't wait to leave. The day after graduation, I packed everything I owned into a used pickup truck. Dad shook my hand. Like I was a stranger. Vanessa barely looked up from her phone. Tyler laughed and asked if I'd be back by Christmas. I wasn't. I moved to Denver with $600 and a lot of anger. For years, I worked nonstop. Construction sites, warehouse shifts, anything I could get. Slowly, my life improved. I met my wife, Rachel, started a business, bought a house, built a life. And through all of it, Grandpa stayed in touch. Weekly phone calls, birthday cards, visits whenever he could manage. He never treated me like I was disposable. And that mattered more than he probably knew. Then came the call. I was 29. Grandpa had suffered a stroke. I flew to Ohio immediately. When I arrived at the hospital, Vanessa was already there. Acting concerned, acting devoted, acting like she'd always cared. The truth was, she rarely visited him, but she knew his company had grown enormously over the years. She knew who was worth millions, and suddenly she was very interested. Grandpa survived the stroke. But he wasn't the same afterward. His health declined quickly. During one visit, he asked everyone to leave the room except me. Then he said quietly, "Whatever happens, don't fight them." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He smiled, the kind of smile that suggested he knew something I didn't. "Promise me." I promised. 3 months later, he died. The funeral was packed. Employees, friends, neighbors, people whose lives he'd helped. And despite everything, I was devastated, because I hadn't just lost a grandfather. I'd lost the closest thing I ever had to a parent. A week later came the will reading. I expected nothing. Maybe a keepsake, a watch, a photograph. Something sentimental. Instead, the attorney read a revised will dated 6 months before Grandpa's death. Most of the estate went to Dad. Large portions went to Vanessa and Tyler. I received an old tackle box. That was it. I sat there stunned. Not because I wanted money, but because it didn't make sense. This was the man who called every week. The man who never missed a birthday. The man who told me he was proud of me. The attorney finished reading. Vanessa smiled, actually smiled. Then she looked at me and said, "I guess your grandfather knew who was really there for him." I felt like I'd been punched. Dad said nothing. Tyler smirked. And suddenly, every childhood memory came rushing back. Every moment of rejection. Every reminder that I wasn't enough. I wanted to fight, I wanted answers. Then I remembered Grandpa's words, "Don't fight them." So I stood up, picked up the tackle box, and left. That was the last time I spoke to any of them for years. Back in Denver, I focused on my own life. My company grew. Rachel and I welcomed our first daughter, then our second. For the first time ever, I felt something I hadn't felt as a child. Peace. Meanwhile, things weren't going well for my family. I heard bits and pieces through relatives. Dad retired early. Tyler joined Grandpa's company despite having no experience. Vanessa inserted herself into every major decision. Within 3 years, revenue dropped dramatically. Good employees left. Clients followed them. Lawsuits started appearing, nothing criminal, just bad management, bad decisions, expensive mistakes. Still, none of that involved me, and I intended to keep it that way. Then one morning, 5 years after Grandpa's death, I received a phone call from an attorney in Ohio. Not the same attorney, a different one. He asked if we could speak privately. I assumed it was spam, but curiosity got the better of me. So I listened. That's when he told me something that changed everything. 2 months earlier, an elderly woman named Margaret Lewis had passed away. She had been Grandpa's executive assistant for nearly 20 years. Before her death, she instructed the attorney to deliver a package she had been safeguarding. A package addressed to me, and another addressed to Vanessa, left by Grandpa 5 years earlier. My heart started racing. The attorney explained that Grandpa had paid Margaret to hold both items until a specific date. That date had finally arrived. I flew to Ohio the next day. The package waiting for me contained a handwritten letter and copies of documents. I sat alone in the attorney's office and began reading. The first line nearly broke me. "Ethan, if you're reading this, then the people I expected to disappoint you have done exactly that." I had to stop. I couldn't breathe. It felt like Grandpa was sitting beside me again. The letter was several pages long. He explained everything. Over the years, he had noticed Vanessa pressuring him constantly about his estate. She pushed for changes, suggested Tyler deserved more, claimed I wasn't interested in the family. Grandpa suspected their motives, so he created a plan. The revised will wasn't the real inheritance. It was a test. The documents attached revealed something incredible. 5 years before his death, Grandpa had quietly transferred ownership of valuable commercial properties into a separate trust. A trust completely outside the estate, A trust with only one beneficiary. Me, legally established, properly documented, impossible to challenge. The properties generated substantial income, and after 5 years of growth, they were worth significantly more than the entire estate Vanessa had fought over. I stared at the paperwork, speechless. Then I reached the final page. There was one more paragraph. Ethan, wealth reveals character, so does disappointment. I already knew yours. I wanted to see theirs. I cried, not because of the money, because for the first time in my life, someone had believed me completely. Someone had seen everything. At the same time, Vanessa received her package. The attorney later told me she arrived expecting another inheritance. Instead, she received a letter. One letter, nothing else. According to the attorney, she turned pale halfway through reading it. The letter detailed years of manipulation Grandpa had witnessed, conversations he'd documented, attempts to isolate him, pressure campaigns regarding his assets, and one final sentence. The greatest mistake you made was believing I couldn't see you. Then came the revelation about the trust. Legally, there was nothing she could do. Nothing Dad could do. Nothing Tyler could do. The properties belonged to me. Period. News spread through the family fast. Suddenly, my phone started ringing. Relatives I hadn't heard from in years reached out. Then Dad called. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail. Ethan, we need to talk. For the first time in my life, he sounded nervous. A week later, he called again. Then again. Eventually, I answered. There was a long silence. Then he said, I didn't know. I laughed, not because it was funny, because it was unbelievable. You didn't know what? About the trust. No, Dad. I mean all of it. Silence, then I continued. You didn't know Vanessa treated me differently? You didn't know Tyler got special treatment? You didn't know I spent my entire childhood trying to earn your approval? Still silence. Finally, he whispered, I should have done better. Those 6 words arrived 20 years too late. We spoke for less than 10 minutes. When the call ended, I felt lighter, not because he'd apologized, because I no longer needed one. A few months later, Grandpa's company finally collapsed. Years of poor leadership had caught up with them. Assets were sold. Employees moved on. The business Grandpa spent decades building disappeared, and the irony wasn't lost on anyone. The people who fought hardest for control were the ones who destroyed it. Meanwhile, the trust properties continued performing well. I used part of the income to establish scholarships for trade school students. Something Grandpa would have loved. I also funded apprenticeship programs through my company, helping young people build careers. Building something instead of tearing something down. Then came the final twist. About a year later, I learned through relatives that Tyler had discovered something shocking. Vanessa wasn't his biological father's only secret. She had hidden significant debt from everyone, including Dad. Debt accumulated over years of reckless spending. The financial pressure contributed heavily to the family's collapse. Dad eventually divorced her, not because of one lie, because of hundreds. The marriage built on appearances finally fell apart under the weight of reality. Last year, Dad asked if we could meet, in person, for the first time in nearly a decade. We met at a small diner outside Columbus. He looked older, smaller somehow. Like life had finally forced him to see himself honestly. For 2 hours, we talked, really talked. He admitted he chose the easier path. That challenging Vanessa would have created conflict. And letting me carry the burden was simpler. Hearing it hurt. But at least it was honest. Before we left, he said something unexpected. Your grandfather was right about you. I nodded, then replied, he usually was. That was it. No dramatic reconciliation, no movie ending. Just 2 men acknowledging